Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're talking about all things effects loops. Do they really make that much of a difference? Let's find out. Alright, so as I said before, today we're talking about all things effects loops. Now, I myself was pretty ignorant to using effects loops and to the difference that they really can make. I was very surprised in making this video just how much I was missing out on by not using an effects loop. And I actually feel pretty frustrated because now, having made this video, I feel like I need to rewire my pedal board and create a separate in and out for the effects loop for my modulation effects and my time-based effects. Now, first things first, for those of you who are unaware of what an effects loop does, no worries, this is what they do. In your amplifier, you have a preamp and a power amp. The preamp is responsible for taking the signal that comes from your guitar, which is fairly weak and kind of brittle sounding, and it boosts it to what we call line level. After it goes through your preamp section, it then goes to the power amp section where it takes that signal and boosts it even further so that it can be amplified through the speaker. Now, in the preamp section is where most of your tone coloring takes place. It's typically where your EQ sits, as well as where you can control how much gain or saturation mixes into your signal. An effects loop is a send and a return, or a bus that sits between your preamp stage and your power amp stage, so that way the tone coloring and the line lifting that exists within the preamp stage occurs before you add in certain effects. And then with that loop, it would be able to pass through certain effects and come back into the power amp stage and be put out through the speaker. It's essentially about trying to get the most pure tone that you can get out of certain effects. Now, while there are no rules when it comes to building your tone and what order to put pedals and things in, the general guideline that people use when it comes to using an effects loop is to put your modulation-based effects and your time-based effects through it. We don't typically put gain or overdrive or fuzz through it because we'd rather have those in front of the preamp so that we're stacking with whatever gain might occur in the preamp. Your modulation effects are effects such as these. Now, to give you the simplest definition, it's essentially that they cause the waveforms of your signal to actually move. Sometimes they duplicate the signal and adjust it that way. Other times, like in the case of tremolo, they are actually turning the volume up and down, making it so that your signal is louder than softer than louder than softer. We'll talk a little bit more about how all of these work after the demo process, but this is just a brief introduction of what sort of effects we might be looking at. Now, your time-based effects are effects that take your signal and replicate it in a way like reverb, where it gives it a cavernous or a hall-like texture, or delay, where it replicates the signal in a time-based pattern. Now, let's go ahead and move into the demo phase. In the demos, there are two distinct sections. There's a clean amplifier sound and an overdriven amplifier sound. This is because there are essentially two different types of players out there. There are people who have their guitar amp set to relatively clean to the edge of breakup, who utilize pedals when they want to get extra gain. And then there are those who run their amp dirty consistently. It all depends on what kind of music you play and what kind of player you are, so I wanted to make sure I covered both of those styles. The overdrive in the overdriven section is provided solely by the amp's preamp. In each demo, you will hear a dry signal with no effects, and then you will hear what the effects sound like going in through the front of the amp or in front of the preamp, and then you will hear what it sounds like when it goes through the effects loop, meaning after the preamp but before the power amp. After the demos, we'll go ahead and talk about the nitty-gritty and why it made such a difference. Enjoy. All right, hopefully that was as educational to you as it was to me. Here's the deal. In order to understand why this makes such a big difference, we have to first understand compression. Now, in order to understand compression, I think we kind of have to go in through the back door of saturation. Saturation occurs when compression and overdrive mix. The simplest way that I can explain compression to you is I want you to go to like a fuzz pedal especially, or if you don't have a fuzz pedal, then just get a lot of overdrive on your signal. Turn it all the way up. And what you'll notice is that if you take your guitar and you pluck a string as soft as humanly possible, you'll notice that it is still very, very loud. At the same time, if you take that same string and you pluck it really, really hard, it will be just as loud as that super soft one. That is what compression does. Compression takes your quietest notes and makes them louder, and it takes your loudest notes and makes them softer. Now, overdrive, what it does is it takes your signal and it does what we call clips it. Takes the actual waveform and shaves off the top of it. There's soft clipping and hard clipping. That's a completely different video. The main point is that's that gritty sound. That is overdrive. Compression is the reason why when you pluck it softly, it's just as loud as if you pluck it as hard as possible. That is what we call saturation. Remember, saturation is the combination of compression and overdrive. Now, that is a really aggressive compression. There is compression with some actual dynamic variation, meaning that it may take your soft notes and bring them up, but it doesn't make them as loud as your loudest. But it still boosts that signal and compresses it together and limits that range of volume that you could potentially be getting. And that's what a preamp does. Even when the amp was clean, this is why a lot of those effects didn't necessarily sound as good as when you place them after the preamp, because that compression occurs in the preamp. I do think it's important to add a disclaimer that this is all a matter of preference, and there may even be instances where you want these tones that, distort the effect after the fact. I'm talking strictly about trying to hear the tones in a way where they come across as cleanly as possible, and also kind of my own personal preference here for a general sound. There may be instances where, especially in recording scenarios, where I may rewire things and want certain tones. But for an overall setup, I do think it might be worth it to have that effects loop. So, as usual, there are no rules. Do whatever you want. Nothing matters. Let's take reverb as our first example. The reverb tail is supposed to be able to gradually drop off until it dissipates, and that's how we get that hall and cavernous feel. However, when we compress that, it means that as it drops off, it won't be able to drop off as smoothly because those lower, quieter moments are being pulled up by compression and made louder. Another example is how terrible the tremolo sounded on every single example where the tremolo came before the preamp. It's because tremolo acts as if you took the volume knob on your guitar and literally just turned it up and down really, really fast. However, when it's compressed, it means that as the volume was dropping off, the compression kicked in and brought it back up, so you couldn't even hear the tremolo in a lot of instances. This is our first reason as to why the effects loop makes such a big difference. It's because we're putting it after the compression that occurs in the preamp section, where your guitar signal is being brought to line level. The second reason why these effects don't work well before the preamp has to do with saturation. Now, the saturation really occurs more in the overdriven section, where the preamp is actually driving the signal and giving it that crunchy, gritty tone. Here's an example of what an overdriven guitar tone looks like as a wave. You can see that the peaks and valleys are now being shaved off to create a sharper angle, or in some cases a really sharp angle like the hard clipping that you see there. Now let's look at an example of what a phasing waveform looks like. These modulating effects usually take your guitar's signal and either delay it slightly or invert it slightly so that there is some opposition between the peaks and valleys of the two waveforms. However, when you overdrive it, you're actually adjusting the height and the shape of those waveforms and making it so that they cannot phase as well as they inherently want to. On top of that, with time-based effects like delay or reverb, what the preamp does is it accidentally distorts those effects as well. And so not only are they being compressed, but now they're being distorted and they're losing their clarity as they repeat. All of this to say, I was very surprised that it really did make that much of a difference. Obviously the science is there and it makes sense, but until you really send those effects through the preamp and then put them in a loop, you really don't know how much you are missing of your effects pedals. I didn't know that chorus could sound as good as it did when I put it through an effects loop, and that was on the clean section. I didn't realize how much of the trem I was missing. I didn't realize how many frequencies were overwhelming my delays and my reverbs. But of course, what did you guys think? Do you already have a board that has an effects loop in it? Have you experimented with putting other pedals through the effects loop? Do you think it's worth it to have that extra cabling and put it through? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching and tuning in. Please, as always, feel free to like and subscribe. It does help the channel out, makes my day a little bit better. But even if you don't make my day better, please go make someone else's day better. It will make yours better as well. My name is Mac Wright. Thank you so much. We'll see you around. This is a cat. This is Emmy Lou. She's my anxiety-ridden little best friend that follows me everywhere. Say hi to the camera. Oh, that's really uncomfortable looking. Shouldn't like to be picked up either. All right, girly. Oh!